welcome everyone to this first lecture in the Sam Fox School of Design, Global Urbanism Studio, Bucky Spaceship Earth Reboot. Today we're joined by Doreen Adengo of Adengo Architects, who will be giving our first lecture in a series of kind of regional snapshots, and which mark the beginning of a set of design workshops in our studio. We're joined today by 9 students from Uganda Martyrs University and 17 students from Washington University in St. Louis. We also have Derek Hoferlin, the chair of our program, here on the call with us, as well as Tony Blackwolf, our documentary photographer. So I'm really so happy to introduce Doreen Adengo to all of you WashU students today. Doreen has been a partner over the last, I guess, year, working with the studio. We worked with Doreen last year in Kampala, Uganda. Doreen is trained as an architect and a licensed architect, and has started a firm in Kampala, Uganda, and has been doing some really interesting workshops over the past few years as a way of rethinking the impact of architecture and design in Uganda. So I guess the order of operations for today will be that we have this just kind of brief introduction. I'm going to actually play a recording for all of us of Doreen's lecture. It's been pre-recorded just to try to avoid any challenges with internet connection. And then we'll have a live Q&A at the end, which will be open to everybody. So if you're able to comment, you can turn off your mic at the end, or you can also type in questions in the chat, and we'll get to those afterwards. So just a little context on the studio. This studio is obviously being taught remotely in light of the current pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And the studio deals broadly with how the current crisis, has become an opening to think about our long-term resilience strategies in the face of future crises, such as climate change or any number of other things. So, so we've taken the approach to work globally, to think about how the crisis has expressed itself and revealed strengths and weakness at the global scale, and are working with a series of design experts and designers and friends over the summer to think about proactive responses to crisis adaptation. So, oh yeah, Tony, you're more than welcome to record the video if you would like. So this, this semester or this lecture really kind of marks the beginning of a series of collaborations with Doreen. And it's my hope that in the studio we're able to begin to understand an amazing range of adaptations and responses to the crisis in cities and non-cities all over the world.
Hi everyone, I'm Doreen Adengo, based in Kampala, Uganda. I'm really happy to be part of this year's Global Urbanism Studio. We've selected to do 2 weeks in Kampala, where we're looking at Nakasero Market, and I'll talk about that more in detail. This presentation is going to be 45 minutes, so I'm going to jump right into it. We'll have a section for question and answers, but feel free to ask your questions in the side chat as I'm speaking, and we'll respond as we go through it, and also towards the end. So let me share my screen. Share. Okay, I hope that you can see my presentation view. Okay, here we are. So Global Urbanism Studio, Kampala Workshop. This is a collaboration between Washington University in St. Louis students and students from Uganda Martyrs University in Uganda. And so from from what I understand, there are 17 students from WashU, and we're going to have 9 students from UMU, is what we call it, also called Nkozi. And we're going to find a way to collaborate and work together. So just to give you a quick summary of what's going on in Kampala right now, what you see here is a picture of, okay, the sound should be much better now. I forgot to turn off the fan, it's really hot. But anyway, so what you see here is a photograph of Nakasero Market. Nakasero Market is the largest and most vibrant market in Kampala. And we initially had a 14-day lockdown, which was then, sorry, it was a 21-day lockdown that was increased again by 14 days. However, during this period, the market had to remain open because, for one, most people are dependent on fresh food, and so the markets cannot close. Also, it's a source of income for a lot of people, and so for that reason also it couldn't close. So this very public, very crowded space had to find a way to adapt to the condition, to guidelines that were given by the government, and also to social distancing. So what you see here is each stall is much smaller. They used to be much larger. I'm sure you've seen the past Global Urbanism Studio from last year, and you can see that the drastic difference between what it used to look like and what we're looking at now. Each vendor was also asked to get a smaller umbrella. The umbrellas used to be much bigger. This is because there's surveillance. You know, there's a market management that wants to be able to see each vendor and make sure that there is social distancing between vendors and also with the customers. And these lines that you see, the string, is also just ensuring that everything is spaced out. And one of the approaches, for example, because this place obviously had much more vendors within a certain square footage, because there are fewer vendors per square footage, they now have a system where they're rotating. And we'll talk about this more once we get into the actual program and assignment. But it's just important to note that in Kampala and Uganda in general, we've faced a threat of Ebola about 3 times. And so this pandemic is not as big a shock to the average person because we've been through it before. Also, the government in a way is prepared because they had to go through the setting up quarantine, setting up medical tents. They'd even come up with hand washing points before in the past encounters with Ebola. And so transitioning into this was actually much smoother. Making the public aware also was something that happened really well. And luckily there've been no deaths. There are infections and the numbers are gradually rising, but we're trying really hard to keep things moving, but also being careful. So that's just a brief summary of what's going on right now. So I'm going to now skip to just an overview of Kampala. I'm imagining that I'm addressing someone who knows nothing about Uganda, nothing about Kampala. So I'm just giving a very brief history of how we got to where we are now. So Kampala initially was built on 7 hills. It's right next to Lake Victoria. What you see here is the lake, and in between each hill, there are wetlands. So this is one hill that's a wetland before you go to the next hill, another wetland before you go to the next hill, and so forth. And initially, this is what Kampala was. It was the Buganda Kingdom. What you see in this sketch is one of the hills, which is Mengo Hill, and the King's Palace at the top of the hill. What's important to know, this is pre-colonial times, before the first British explorers arrived. The sketch was made by one of the first British explorers that came to the Buganda Kingdom. What's important to note is that the king had his palace in the top of a hill, but each king moved to a different hill. The idea of a permanent building didn't exist at the time. The materials used for building were impermanent, like wood, thatch, reeds, grass. The idea is that you constantly renewed your structure and rebuilt it. And so the idea of permanence just didn't exist. What you see here is a plan, the king's palace, their chiefs around him, and wives, and there's a very clear system of the way things were organized at the time. So now I'm going to fast forward and jump many years. The first British explorers came to Uganda in 1886. And what we're seeing here now is from the 1950s. So by now, Uganda is a British protectorate, and the British administration wanted to plan a city. And so what you see here is a plan by Ernst May, German architect who moved to East Africa during this time. He was based in Nairobi and got the assignment to do the plan in Kampala. And he applied the Garden City plan, imagining each hill as its own satellite city. And you still see traces of that today. Each hill has a residential area, a commercial area within it, but there's also a central business district, which is, you can see here in this diagram, which still exists today, and it's grown over time. So this is one of the plans at the city planning office in the 1950s. And so what you see again is these different hills that are being defined. And what you see in green are the wetlands between the hills. The wetlands are really important because they filter water before it gets to the lake. And that's kind of how the system works. But it's also important to understand that during this time, it was thought, I wonder if this is moving. Yeah, because this key is really important. If we put this in that context, Ernst May believed that by including the different races in the plan, he was actually being inclusive. Because at this time, many city plans were made in Africa and did not really, by the colonial governments, and did not include the local population. So what to us looks like a really strange plan, he thought he was doing something progressive. So as you can see from here, these lines are the European zone. So this is Kololo, Nakasero. The African zone is here, Nakawa, and then there's Asian, and by Asian it means Indian zones. And so these three different races, the idea is that they would live separately and separated by these wetlands. So in this case, the wetlands, the purpose of it was different. What's interesting is today, these areas had the most developed infrastructure during this time, and to this day, you can still see traces of that. So on to the next slide. So this is Kampala in okay, let me move this up. This is Kampala, there we go. This is Kampala in 1962. That's when we got our independence. The city at the time was being built for 50,000 people. In the center is the parliament, and there's a lot of government buildings. They still are today. And you can see a lot of open space and not very high buildings, maximum 4 floors. This is 1962. And so today, the population has gone up from 50,000 people to 3 million, growing within a space where the infrastructure hasn't improved much since that independence time, because we went through a very tumultuous period of war and destruction, and all this ended in 1986 when Yoweri Museveni came into power, and there's been progressive development since. I'll now go to one of the courses I taught. This was with the University of Johannesburg, where we got a studio, and the group of students came to look at the wetlands. So what we see here is an image of one of the wetlands. This is Nachibubo Channel. It's one of the largest ones. And you can see that it's crossing through an industrial area. That's why this buildings are of a larger scale than, say, these buildings these are residential. These are informal settlements where you see that it becomes really smaller. These are flats, but this is definitely industrial. That's the industrial area in Kampala. And what is happening is the city is growing, and the only place left to build is the wetlands. However, if people built in the wetlands, it would destroy the ecosystem that would then impact the lake, that would then impact the city. So this course was looking at what can we do about the situation. The students were very brave. These are students not only from South Africa, it was actually a very mixed group of students that were brave and joined us on this exploration. I had never studied what's actually going on in the wetlands, and we were very open about this at the beginning, saying whoever joins our unit is open to discovery. We're going to explore and see what we can come up with. So this is one of the wetlands that we went to, not the one in the industrial area, but this one is kind of in a different area that surprisingly looks more rural, and it has very different, it has very interesting activities going on. For example, brick making. What you see over here are brick burning towers. What the student is doing is looking at the clay or the mud and just trying to understand how they make the brick. And this brick is used a lot in making different kinds of structures. What I'll do is show this video. It's very short, but I think that would be the best way to understand what is going on. So just allow me to play it from here because the rest of the presentation will make sense.
15X really started out as a unit that begins to challenge the way architecture, landscape architecture and urban design are taught.
Kampala is a perfect site for 15X because of the unique topography. It's hilly and right next to the lake, and in between the hills are wetlands that filter into the lake, and that is where our site is. The collaboration between Makerere students and University of Johannesburg students is quite unique. It's the first time it's been done. What I anticipate is that they'll be learning from each other and also a different way of approaching research in the urban context that we're in. And I'm looking forward to seeing the results.
For me, I think Kampala is a very fast-moving city because everything happens at a very fast rate.
My experience working with the students over the week was very beneficial, not only with like the language barrier, but also with their wisdom and their intelligence and their way of looking at things. They hadn't been to the sites that we had been to, so they were also there for the first time, but they had a completely different vision and view and different knowledge of their site, of their country that they could give to us, which was amazing.
I was a bit skeptical at first. I had never been to that particular site. I don't speak Luganda very well, so I was finding it a bit challenging. How am I going to engage with these people? But Dr. Finzi, he worked with us. He made it very comfortable for us to learn, get out of our shells, talk to people, and also the University of Johannesburg students were around, so there was expectation to deliver. So that gave me a bit of courage to get this information because we were the mediators. So we had to help them get the information that they needed.
So working with the students from Makerere and the University of Johannesburg, GSA, has been a rewarding experience. It has shown and proven to me yet again how connected we are as a people, how well we work together, and that continents and countries and borders really do not divide us. There is a lot more that connects us than what divides us.
The site visit was unique. It's a really busy landscape and there's a lot of information to take in. It's very unique. Especially the Nomawanga district. I found that I love that site with the railway, and that's my interest is in the railway. It's really special. I'd love to touch on that further my investigation through us design.
Working with the UJ students, Mina in particular, have been really great. Of course, I've interacted with most of them. Learned a lot from them, all of them. Particularly not very good at the computer-aided skills. that was polished up. Like, I guess from this experience, it's been amazing.
I can see from the way the Macquarie University students apply work, it's very traditional way of doing architecture, and therefore you can see more of hand drawings and more of very not really much of computers. But I think what was interesting was the merge between this traditional and this new way of representing architecture coming together and what it could be.
The highlighted comment we got from that jury, we learned to always look beyond what the person you're interviewing tells you. You're supposed to analyze it and see whether it actually makes sense before you write a report about it.
I think the Unit 15X program or collaboration between the two universities begins to define for me new ways of teaching architecture. We're looking at developing learning that is meaningful, learning that is challenging, learning that speaks to the real development goals that are imperative for the continent of Africa.
I think following this visit, 15X can have a huge impact on how different African universities could work together. I think we all have a lot to learn from each other, and these exchanges should be happening more often. What we hope to do is show the work that has come out of this and try to encourage more of these collaborations in the future.
That's really
Okay. So I'll stop here. So of course, fortunately, they could come to the site, and even the WashU students last year could come to the site. The challenge we're going to have to deal with this year is how to understand a site virtually. And this will be both for the WashU students and the UMU students. We'll have a discussion about this further. But what was very interesting that came out of this collaboration between the UJ students and Macquarie students is a certain way of representing. As was mentioned in the video, the Macquarie students had very strong hand drawing skills, and the UJ students had this computer-based drawing, and so they kind of merged the techniques. And this is a drawing by one of the students called Elau, and what it is, it's a collage, if you kind of look at this one, that talks about a cycle that's going on within the one of the wetlands that he studied in particular. And he was looking at the brick burning and thinking of ways to use the extra heat to do other functions like recycling. And I think one thing to think about, or one challenge that I struggle with even within the practice, is how to represent the kind of conditions that you find in African cities where there's constantly something changing, constantly something moving, nothing is static. Everything's very temporal. So a simple plan elevation section is not enough. We always have to look at a different type of drawing to communicate what it is that we are seeing. And I'd like to challenge the students this year to think about this as well. So just to give you an overview of what it's been like for me to build a practice in Uganda. I moved back to Uganda in 2015, and built solely from working from home to working in a co-working space, and now we finally have our own office. And I'll just take you through the context just for architects within the country. So for one, there's a shortage of architects. There's only 178, as we state, registered architects. By now, they're probably 200, which is still very little for a population of 40 million people. What this shows is the ratio of how fast the city is growing based to the compared to the number of architects. So for Uganda, you can barely see the number of architects, and it's growing really fast, as compared to some of these other cities where you see a large number of architects and a slow urbanizing rate. And so the question or the challenge for us is, how is the city growing if the architects are not involved in the growth? This is my team. So I'd say that collaboration is very core to the way that we're working. And there's two of the staff based here. That's Franklin and Derek, as you see here. And then the person from Germany, had been working here for a couple of internships, actually over 2 years. And even though she eventually moved back, we work remotely. And this is the same for the person from Norway. So we've always been very heavily dependent on online collaboration. So actually moving into the lockdown that we've been in has been very easy because we've always been working online already. So just very quickly, some of the projects in the office. This was GIZ, which is a German foundation, wanted to add a unit for solar energy training at the Nakawa Vocational Training School, and they wanted a temporary structure. And so we came up with this container installation. There were many different configurations till we came up with this one, where there's an indoor and outdoor space that could all be used by the students. This is a mobile clinic that I worked with at the time. There was actually an intern from Ngozi, who's also part of our team that worked on this. And this is the mobile clinic, because there are clinics that move from village to village with doctors, and they tend to have to set up every time they get to a new destination, then deinstall and reinstall when they get to the next place. So this was kind of imagining if there was one unit that moved with the doctors, so they didn't have to go through that. And the idea is that it was off-grid with its own solar energy. We worked with a company called Solar Grid that's actually based in San Francisco. That the largest part of the solar panel system is a battery, and so they come up with what they called an iPhone of solar system, where the battery would be really small and really light, and so it could move easily in this truck. This is still a proposal. We're looking to now make the prototype. The other projects are more permanent buildings, but for example, a building like this, it's a commercial building with apartments at the top. We convince the client to use local materials. So this location that's on Entebbe Road is very close to a clay factory, and most commercial buildings want to use aluka bone and glass. And so to me, the biggest win for this project was to convince the client to use the local materials on his project. This is a close-up of what it is, and the idea is every single material would be sourced locally. And yeah, we're also waiting to get to the point of construction for this one. Here's another proposal for affordable housing. Some of the earlier affordable housing projects that we worked on were single houses, but there's more of a push to think about density. And I think the way the city is growing, it's going to become less and less possible to have single houses. And so we say to try to convince clients that approach us for housing to think of apartment buildings or kind of shared housing spaces, so there can be more people per square meter in terms of housing. And again, here we're using local materials. This was the site, really large and sloping down this way. And the one idea that was different from the typical apartments that we see here is to separate the stair, so that the stairs are like towers between the buildings and shared. So there's less stairs per unit than they are right now. And this is also in the design phase. This is the diagram of one of the units. And here's another one. So we've just gone through the costing, and now we're going to engage a developer, and that's kind of where we are with this one. And so I'll end with this project, which goes back to the beginning. So what I'll say that one of the biggest challenges working in our context is a lot of the projects get to the point of you've finished the working drawings or the construction drawings, and either the client runs off and builds without you. That happens a lot over here. But sometimes by that point, something happens. Sometimes it's that they realize there's an issue with funding, sometimes an issue with the land. And so what I've found over time is that the projects that are more research-based and that are trying to think of different ways of doing things have, in the end, been more successful in that we're able to get to the final output and control the final output a little more. So what I'll say is that yes, long term, I would like the practice to build, but I've understood that it's going to take a long time. And I think for anyone, I guess everyone's speaking to students, just understand that the industry that you've chosen, it just takes very long to realize projects, and that's just what the profession comes with. So with African Mobilities, this is a project where we were one of the teams as part of a larger collaboration with a curator based in South Africa. We're the East African team, there's a team in West Africa, there was someone in Zimbabwe, and each team looked at something different. At the time, we were interested in markets and specifically looking at Kitenge. And I'll start by explaining the team, because collaboration is really core to the way that we work as an office and also the way that we're going to work in this workshop. So what you'll see in the top row is that was the staff that had the architectural skills. And then because we found a lot of things, a lot of information we're gathering was very temporal, things changing, and I'll explain it when we get to that. We realized that we needed a video, for example, to capture all of that. And that's how the videographer got on board. And then we needed to interview people. And that's how the social sciences researcher helped, because we needed to learn how do you write a proper interview? How do you approach, what are the ethics around this? And so that was very helpful. And then this video guy was based in South Africa, and I'll explain why. And then this guy was based here, and he helped a lot with getting the video footage and the photography. And so we worked together as a multidisciplinary team. I think it was very challenging, but also very good, because it forced us to communicate to each other in a different way. And I would say that what I've gotten out of this experience the most is communicating very clearly. So that you're not speaking the, I don't know, architecture talk, I guess how I would put it, but always take the extra step to explain clearly to an audience that may not understand what you're talking about initially. So just very quickly, we picked what I'll call an actor. So we knew we were interested in looking at the refugee community. There's several of them in Kampala, and so we looked at the Congolese, who are mainly trading in Kitenge. And this is because that's an industry they were in before they moved. So we found Elvis and followed him for about 3 months. And what we came up with was based on what we saw with him. This is his shop where he sells the Kitenge from. And this is one of the collages. So basically, so we worked for 6 months, and then there was an exhibition in Munich. So the deliverables for the exhibition were photos, drawings, and collages, and then we added the video, because we realized that without the video, it would be very hard to communicate what we'd found. Again, this is, so what I'll say in summary, because I think there's no time to watch this video, is that we found that Elvis had taken one of his fabrics and gone to a carpenter and asked the carpenter to measure exactly according to the fabric. So it means that the shells here are the unit of a fabric that's folded 4 times. And then there's actually a table here that is the measurement of a fabric that's opened once, and he can open back. And so he'd actually very carefully calculated his space to maximize it according to the dimension of the fabric, how it folds and how it folds out. And I think that that is something, if you're walking by, you would miss it. And so once we saw this, the question was, how would you represent this? So the video, I won't show it here, but I can show you where you can find it. So if you go to the company website, so I'm going to go back. Company website, there's a studio and videos. Oh, that's the WashU video at the top. And then here's a 3x3 video, which I would encourage you to watch, because you'll find out what that's all about. So let's see here, back to full screen. So this is one of the drawings that we worked very hard to develop. It looks very clean right now, but I'll tell you that it took a long time, because what we discovered is that Elvis' shop, when it's closed, it's 3 meters by 1 meter. And when it opens up to a 3 by 3 meter space. And so this drawing was a way to show how it transforms from when it's closed to when it's open. So this and many other types of drawings are what we came up with to think through how to show this transient ephemeral conditions. And I think it's really important to think about this when dealing with African cities, when dealing with the market, which is what we're going to do in these next 2 weeks, because what you'll discover is usually there's something that if you look closely, has been very carefully considered. And there's been measuring, and it's been very thoroughly thought through. And I think it's really important to be able to represent this because it can, for one, I would say, for example, in this case, what we discovered is Elvis is in a building. The building owner presents a different plan to the planning office. The officials see a different plan, and then he builds a different building according to what he knows people like Elvis want. And sometimes in that switching of presenting one plan and building another plan, some of these buildings collapse. A lot of errors happen because of that, almost like, I don't know, two sides of things. So I think that one goal of a project like this is just to bring it to the attention of the officials and say, listen, these guys are building something different because it works for them. Maybe there's a way to have a conversation so that the intended plan can be presented to the building, to the planning office, so that what is built is actually what is needed for use. And so that's one way that this could have an impact. And with that, I'll close this talk. Thanks for listening. I'm open to answering any questions that you have, and look forward to having a really good discussion. Thank you. Back here. Stop. End. Bye. Oh.
So,
okay.
Everybody's left. Nice. Well, thank you. That was super interesting to see the kind of range of research workshops that you've been working on over the past couple of years. I saw there was one question in the chat about the wetlands, and I thought maybe you could expand on that. It was Josiah who had a question about what the attitude is. Or I can read it out here. So, do most people in the city think of wetlands as a benefit or resource, or as a nuisance/obstacle?
Yeah,
Jonathan,
that's a good question.
Sorry, Doreen, could I ask something real quick? Sorry to interrupt, but since I'm assuming everyone has their pictures on because of bandwidth issues, but maybe it'd be nice if it'd be nice to hear Josiah's voice to ask the question. Maybe it'll help stimulate dialogue amongst us. So Josiah, are you there? Could you maybe ask the question just again yourself?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Doreen. Thanks for the video. I actually have all kinds of questions, but I thought it was really interesting and really helpful. So for this question, I was just wondering about the wetlands, since they're kind of all mixed in with the city. Do people, like, on an average, like on a regular day, are they saying like, oh, I wish the wetlands weren't in my backyard because there's mosquitoes or something, or it smells bad? Or are they like going to the wetlands to go for a walk or get water, or do they like them?
So it depends on where the wetland is. If you remember the map, the wetlands are all over the place. So for example, between those two hills, the kind of right now, for example, the president's residence is on Nakasero Hill and most of the embassies are on Kololo Hill. Between those two hills, the wetland is a golf course. And actually functions well as that. Between other hills, you find that the wetland is an informal settlement. If it's more, let's say in the industrial area, it's not very pleasant. But in that area that was in the picture, the one that it's called Chinawataka, very long name. But in Luzira, the wetland there is, to me, it looked more rural. The people planting food. That's where the brick making was happening. There were someone making briquettes as well. Many different activities, and it's not the most pleasant place to live because it floods. But which is why informal settlements are set up there. So I know the easiest way to answer your question is to say each wetland is different. Each one has its benefits and challenges. The biggest challenge is the flooding. And at the end of the day, it's the last space left. So I always think that a good case city is Bogota, because that also has wetlands, and they planned it, and now they're parks or something like that. So ideally, I mean, the issue with the wetlands is not easy to solve because it taps into so many other issues, into housing issues, the fact that the city is growing really fast, just so many different things. And so it's a difficult problem to solve in one go, which is why I think what I want to do is just bring attention to it. I don't think I know the answer. And even from the student, each student came up with their own solutions to specific things they found. I don't think either one of those are answers, but it's good to be aware. So, you know, and if it answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions from you all?
Oh, was there another question here?
I think it was.
Oh, there's only one question. So I'm going to challenge the UMU students. Oh, sorry. You can go ahead while the UMU students should think of a question.
Yeah, Josiah has more questions, so let's.
So I was thinking about how, at least in the U.S. context in relationship to this crisis, the idea of essential has come up a lot in our discussions of what has to remain open or who has to continue going to work. And it's interesting that the market was considered essential because of the kind of daily fresh fruits and vegetables that people have as an important part of their diet. And I just wonder what other industries or businesses or sectors were also deemed to be essential and have continued working during the lockdown.
What I can think of at the top of my head is medical, of course, were the top, and then government officials. Ministry of Health has been at the forefront of all of this, but the different government officials, not all of them, but some of them. So for example, there's the Kampala KCCA, which is the planning office. Some of their departments were still open, and they've actually been fixing stuff around the city during the lockdown. I'll talk about who didn't, and then, so the way the system was in the first 21-day lockdown, if you were considered an essential worker and you were driving to work, you got a sticker on your car that would show that you had permission to be driving. And then there was a complaint because there were some industries that couldn't stop. And mainly because of an income, and anyway, so the president gave a speech and gave permission to, what I remember from that was carpenters, metal workers, contractors, and people working on sites. And then he didn't mention architects. So the architects were thinking, how did everyone on the site get permission except the architect? And so they were kind of in the process of trying to organize themselves to say that they need stickers. And during this time, then the lockdown was kind of lifted. But I think that's also telling in a way that the architects didn't get a sticker, because I think they didn't realize that we're essential at the site, which is really sad. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. I guess maybe a question, because it seems like you've been pretty nimble in kind of adapting your practice to the context of Kampala and thinking about what the future of architecture looks like there. But when you moved back, did you have a sense that this is what your practice would look like, or how did you find ways to build partnerships and kind of find your voice in the city?
That's a good question. So when I moved back, there was one project. It was a school project. The clients were an Australian-based NGO that had built one school, and then we're building the second school. And then I kind of got one project after the other. As I said in the video, each project, something will always happen when it got close to building. So the surprising thing was the Australian NGO also kicked the architects off the project when it came to construction. That was my first experience of that. And it tends to happen a lot. And I as an architect's body, I think we feel unappreciated. So I think globally architects feel unappreciated. We're never paid enough, and all these things. But here, I think we always have to make a case to be on the project during construction. So that I learned as I went along. I think it may seem planned, but it wasn't, but it's just coincidence that I realized that the projects that were moving forward were the ones that were more research-based. And so the company just adapted as things were happening. And if that makes sense.
No, that's perfect. It actually segues nicely to this question that's in the chat from Elijah, asking, he likes the case of Elvis, the Katingi shopman, and looking at his shop when closed and open, it's interesting how he maximizes small spaces. So I'm wondering, what lessons can we learn from this in order to have more deployable units for the various nodes of activity within the city, particularly a city that was planned for so few people and now has such a high population? So how might we think about kind of deployability?
Should we hear from Elijah?
Oh yeah, maybe Elijah.
Yeah, let's hear from him how he answers this question. So Elijah, should we hear directly from you? I know where he is. Is he there?
Yes, hello.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Hi, I guess everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yes, so I enjoyed that case study, given that when you look at his shop when it's closed, and then when he opens it up, he can have 3 by 3 meters. And if we have to look at the various nodes within the city, these are places that have a lot of activity, but then we have a lot of congestion just because people find it hard to organize their merchandise or how to display it. So perhaps we could draw some lessons from this guy called Elvis, and then how can we transfer that to different locations or different places within a city? For example, looking at maybe the market. So given this current crisis of the pandemic, how is someone able to still deliver as much or showcase as much merchandise to the public using a very small space, but then also maintaining the social distance and the current rules that are going on? So that is what I wanted to find out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that's something we'll all discover, because Elvis had the fabric, as you saw, and the way it folded and the measurements. I'll tell you what was so impressive, at least to me, what I found mine. I don't know. I couldn't. They've calculated even the way he carries it on his shoulder, the kind of bag they put the fabric in. The size of that bag has already been calculated to the size of the fabric. So there's bags that they know are only bags for carrying that fabric to maximize the size of the bag that's delivered to him. And then so every single thing is based on that fabric size, even the way they sell it. If you go to buy the fabric, they'll say, do you want 6 yards or 12 yards? That's also based on how they cut and how they fold and all these things. So once we go into the market, if you pick an interest in something like that, you'd have to study what the person is actually doing, because it's not arbitrary. You would find that someone probably has come up with a solution. It's based on something that they're selling or something that they have. So it's still, you still have to investigate. The way I understood this with Elvis is I decided to sit there for a whole day and do a time lapse. So time lapse can be done automatically. I found out from Franklin in my office, but at the time I actually sat there and every 5 minutes I pressed the button. But because I was sitting there and looking, I watched and I realized that everything he did was so precise. And then we asked him later, how did you make the shells? And then he told us that he went to the carpenter with the fabric. So you'd also have to have the patience in this other context to find out what is there. That would be my answer to your question. So, you know.
Nice. No, that's
okay. Thank you.
That's great. Are there any other questions in the chat?
Yes, Elizabeth.
I had a question just about the density that you were talking about. I mean, I think the what Elijah, right, that was, yeah, what Elijah's question also deals with is density, and the housing that you're designing or the conversations you're having around density seem really important. And I wonder how the designs you're putting forth are both respective of the kind of household structure or the number of people that might live in one unit, and also kind of providing an alternative way of living densely. So like, what's the quality of density that you're proposing in your work or in your conversations?
So right now, it's not a scientific like calculation, but what I know is there's a cultural feeling. The average person here feels that they need their house to be on land. That if you tell the average Ugandan that you can buy that apartment on the 4th floor of this building, it doesn't make sense to them. They want a house that's sitting on the land. So they want their house on the ground. So they just want they want a one-story bungalow. So for those, the housing project that I showed you, when those clients first approached us, it's huge land that they own. It's been passed down over generations. And so they said they want to do houses where they own some of them, rent out some of them, trying to figure out the kind of configuration. And they wanted single houses on the ground. And so the first thing I said to them is, it can't be a single house on the ground the way the city is growing. It has to be apartments. So then to convince them as a family to move from the single house to an apartment was a discussion, and we had to sit down with I happen to have a good friend who worked in the housing industry, and he has a background in economics, so he knew the calculation. So the calculation that he uses, to be honest, I don't know it, but was able to convince them that if you calculate it this way, think of how much you spend to build this and what you make up over time. It's much better if there's more density than if there's less. That's how we put the case towards them. I don't know if that makes sense. But yeah, there is a math calculation, which I don't know off the top of my head, but what I tend to deal with is the more kind of cultural, trying to convince someone that it can't be a house on the ground. And we're all probably going to end up in apartments because of the way the city is growing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's super interesting. It looked like there was one question here. So Josiah, do you want to pop in for another question?
Sure. So I was wondering, when you were talking about how like the permit process of the building and the architects, I think there was like some back and forth, and what got permit, or like what gets approved isn't necessarily what gets built. And then so I was wondering how that works. Also, like if Elvis as the shopkeeper has like these really specific needs, is he kind of just building his own shop space, so he's responsible for that and he can make it work to his needs? Or does like the architect know what he needs and is designing it for him?
Okay. Or maybe I didn't describe it clearly. So what happens is there's building owners that want to build the building, and they know what the planning office, what they want to see. So they present that to the planning office that matches the rules and everything. Then when they go to build, the way I found this out is when we measured Elvis's place and saw that it was 3 by 3, and so were the others, all around 10 square meters. 3 by 3 becomes 9 square meters, but more or less 10 square meters is what most of the shops happen to be. I called an engineer that I work with, and I said, why is it a 3 by 3? Does it have something to do with the structural grid? Is a column every 3 meters because of some? Then he said no, and he said, the fact that they have columns every 3 meters is such a waste. The columns could be 10 meters apart. It could be there could be less columns. And he explained to me that they're doing that because the building owner knows that the smallest square meters he can rent is around 10 square meters. So that's the unit that he uses to factor how many shops he can have in his building, and that's how then he changes the columns and changes everything afterwards and makes the building that way.
Gotcha.
So I don't know if that answers your question. That's how it works out. And so Elvis was not even in a shop. He was in an area that was supposed to be a storage. That's why it was 3 by 1. It was a closet that then opened into the corridor, like the walkway. Yeah.
Okay.
So
thank you.
In an ideal world, I don't know if it would ever happen, in an ideal world, the people in the planning office need to know why the builder is changing the plan. And maybe they need to rethink their standards. There shouldn't be a mismatch between what is shown to them and what is built.
Mm-hmm.
I know, but I don't know if that's something that could be solved. Sorry, you were going to say something? No? Okay.
And we have one question from Khalid.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for the lecture. I have one question. Like, what's the role of architects and designers in protecting the Kampala's endangered species? I saw there are many the rhino, the elephant, and many other species are endangered. How designers can protect them as a mission? Thanks.
Are these animals in the wetland or where are these animals? Mean in the city or in the country?
In the country overall.
Oh, in the country. Okay. If you're saying in the country, you mean in terms of parks, like national parks?
Yeah. I mean, when designers what can designers do to protect the endangered species?
I don't know. I think the one place that I could say this applies to is there's a waterfall at, why am I? It's not on, okay, we have hydroelectricity, but there's a proposal all of a sudden to have another one in Murchison Falls, which is also where one of the best national parks is. So right now there's a petition led by, well, at least I got it from one of the architects that are trying to, there's many people opposing this construction of a new hydroelectricity dam because it will impact the animals. Because putting that infrastructure there will have an impact on the animals there. But it's always political, so I don't know what's going to happen in the end. But that's one way that I have seen architects having a voice and saying, no, we shouldn't build here. Mainly for the whole ecological system, not just the animals, but everything connected there would be destroyed if something was built. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
So maybe part of that's the idea of the architect as advocate to a certain extent. And I think that your work, your answer to a previous question about your practice kind of emerging around kind of research questions, actually kind of helping to push the project forward. And I wonder what the maybe this is too big of a, asking you to speak for too many people, but like, what is either the attitude towards climate change there? Is there kind of a broad understanding of the impacts? And what do you see as like the major threats of climate change to the region of Kampala or Lake Victoria generally? So it's kind of like two parts. Like, are people on board with climate change as a challenge? And what do you see as the challenges?
Well, I think within Kampala, the biggest challenge is flooding. That's what we're experiencing now. And right now, the level of the lake has gone up. And so there's actually a market, a really popular market in an area called Gava, which is now been flooded. It's almost like, imagine, it was just like Nakasero market, but by the lake. And now they can't be there anymore because water has come in. I don't know, we don't know yet if it's climate change that's been the cause of this or something else. There's also higher temperatures, it's hotter longer, and the rainy seasons have changed also. So it's raining more in times when we weren't expecting rain, and then hotter for longer periods of time. So I don't know the answer, but I know that to me, what I'm most worried about is the flooding, because it's becoming more and more of an issue. But I don't know if it's connected to climate change. That's, yeah.
Cool.
Or is it just the increase of population, people are building more, there's more runoff of water after it rains, and so there's more flooding. Yeah. That could be something also to investigate as we're doing the research over the next year. Yeah.
Totally. Cool. Are there any other questions from the audience out there?
I think there really needs to be a question from, oh, I see a question from Jonathan. Is that a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So one of the things that came up in our investigation last year was when we got down to the market and spoke to people, one of the things they asked us is, what are you studying at the university? And we said, we're architecture and urban design students. And to them, it was a bit of a mystery that architecture students are not looking to build. So all at first they were a bit apprehensive because they thought we were going to do what the rest of the city is doing, and uprooting small ground level markets and building high-rise things, because in their minds they expected that's what architects do, they build things. And I think for the benefit of WASHI students, in local languages in Uganda, a lot of people refer to architects as something loosely translated to a person who draws building plans. So in my question, I bring up the part you mentioned about when the president allowed some people to go back to work, but he curiously did not mention architects. And also at the same time, at the very beginning of the lockdown, there was that building that collapsed in Entebbe, closer to the airport. And then my thinking is, my question is, what do you think is the way forward to make it clearer in the minds of both the everyday person and the people in power, what the role of the architect is?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, yeah, it's interesting that you pointed out the people in the market last year were wondering why we were there. And first there's a fear that we're going to suggest a building. Then they're surprised that we're just asking questions. And then, yeah, it's really surprising that the president didn't mention architects at all in his essential workers. Mentioned the contractors, the carpenters, the welders, and everyone else except the architects. And there's a misconception, as Jonathan has just said, the word for architect locally translates to say drawer of a plan, not even plans, but a plan. And most people will ask you, can you draw a plan for me? And yet we do so many different things. And so there's a miscommunication. Well, there's a misunderstanding about what an architect really is. And so there's the Uganda Society of Architects. It's the architect, I I guess, lobby group. And then there's the ARB, the Architects Registration Board, which is the more regulator, I guess, of everything. And I've been on the education committee in the ARB for now, I think this would be the 4th year. And it's partly that architects feel that they're this kind of elite profession, and why do they need to explain themselves, kind of thing. But also, I think there's a role for young people. For example, Jonathan, yourself and Tadeo, you do the Set of Architects magazine. There has to be a way for that magazine to go beyond just the architects. Because now it has improved a lot and has really interesting articles, but it's only circulated amongst architects. There has to be a way to get our message across to the general public. But the question is how, you know? So I don't have a quick answer, but I know it has to, it's almost like we need a PR campaign without hiring PR people. But what we are and what the public thinks we are, and even what the president probably thinks we are, it's completely different. So I don't know. I don't have a quick answer, but I think it's on the younger generation, because the more of you join, with new skills, new techniques, new ways of communicating, maybe that will start to change and people get to understand what we do. So I don't know what you guys think about this. But it's a very good question. I don't have any straight answer. I can just say that, that yeah.
But
optimistic. Sorry, go ahead.
But I agree with Doreen.
Why we're all here.
Oh.
Sorry, Achilles. Yeah, go ahead.
Achilles is here. All right, let's hear from you. Achilles?
Yeah. So because right now the school, yeah, right now the internationality and even the local community are more open to listening to contributions. Like they want to involve students in so many more discussions. So I think if students get more involved in this and have good projects at the end, then they would make a clearer case for the profession as a whole. But I would say nationally, the response to climate change and to those challenges is more of a responsive, a reactionary approach. If something goes wrong, then they run in and solve it. But there has been no realistic approach of a planning structure towards protecting the environment in any aspect, land, water, or land, sea, and air.
Thank you, Achilles, and welcome. Nice to hear your voice again. Derek, did you have something you were going to chime in?
Well, yeah, I'm actually picking up on Achilles. I think that's a really interesting point because it reinforces, you know, the question, is it climate change that's causing things? And what Doreen, and I think a lot of us as urban designers and architects, it's a combination. So like whether it's how do you start to make clear about issues of flooding? It's not just about climate change, but it might have to do with stormwater runoff or the hydropower plant or something like that. And we have that ability to visualize that and tell the story. What I think is really fascinating about what Doreen presented and what others are talking about is the precision that Doreen is putting forward, the idea of measurement and, you know, dimension and space. And that's like, it's real, it's physicality. It's not just diagrams and policy recommendations, and it's not abstract, it's real. And I think like going right into the scale of reality and how Elvis transforms his space and with limitations, I think is a really important lesson for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think trying to read the limitations as well. I mean, it was interesting to me, Doreen, that you started your lecture by talking about the wetland. even though, you know, my experience in Kampala is much more like Nakasero Market is is the heart of Kampala. But I think the wetlands and the kind of spatial constraints. Oh, hey, Max and Jake.
Sorry, yeah, we're joining in the kids.
But I think that as a designer, kind of recognizing the constraints of your context is what makes the work strong, and makes it timely and makes it pertinent. And I hope that that's what we can start to accomplish in the workshop, is a like really close reading of what are the kind of design inputs and the design conditions that we need to be responsive to, and how do they mark this critical historical moment of the COVID-19 crisis, and then also give us an opening to think about proactive solutions to climate change. And I think Derek's point about it being a recursive system is also really important, that it's not that climate change causes one thing, but it causes many cascading responses. And I think that with the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen these kind of dominoes falling or cascading responses in ways that we hadn't anticipated. So I hope that we can start to register and recognize that through this workshop with the intelligence and experience of the students from Uganda Martyrs, and the kind of curiosity and openness and sort of intensely observational attitude of the WashU students. So I think we're sort of uniquely positioned to fold together our kind of two worlds of being in St. Louis and in Kampala to try to find some of those reactions. So would you like the last word, Doreen?
Okay. I thought that was the last one. No, I think thanks for listening. I'm glad that everyone has participated and asked really good questions. Oh, looks like there's another comment by Christine de Guzman. But I saw it too late, unfortunately. So we'll have to answer that later. But I think that all I can say is that the process of building the practice has been a journey, and I kind of discover as I go along. It's also based on the team themselves. Each person has a certain strength that helps. And it also takes patience, because a lot of these challenges we come across, there's no quick solution. Or even the story with Elvis, what we saw and what we were able to represent. All I can say, well, I guess, yeah, it's advocacy, as you said, to advocate for the different conditions that we come across, but I've kind of recognized it's very hard to solve. And this is going to be a very long journey. And what I tell the people I work with and students that I interact with is this is a kind of profession where it just takes so long, and hopefully you're all in it for the long haul. On a positive note, I would say that we all look happier and younger because what we do is something that we really like. So I'm looking forward to seeing all your passion and your thoughts and energy as we look at the market, because this is another case where we're going into a place that I don't know much about the market now in this condition. We're all going to discover together. I've been to a market a couple of times in the lockdown, but to actually go in and study, this will be the first time. So it'll be very interesting to see what we all find out that they've come up with. Yeah. So
Wonderful.
Looking forward to it. Okay.
Well, thanks. I can clap because I'm unmuted.
Okay.